Hi, I'm Julie Rack, and I'm a professor in the Department of English and Film Studies at the University of Alberta, and I'm very excited that today I get to be the moderator for an amazing panel about digital media in a post-truth era. Each one of our panelists is from the University of Alberta. I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then we're going to start with a few interesting questions. I would like to remind you that you can follow along on our Twitter hashtag ATW2017. If you have any questions for the panel, we're going to leave some time at the end in order to let your questions be heard here and addressed. First we have Carrie Smith-Prei. She is an associate professor in the Department of Modern Languages and Cultural Studies here, and is also the graduate chair for MLCS. Then we have William Anselmi. He is a professor in Modern Languages and Cultural Studies. Sourayan Mookerjea, who's an associate professor in sociology. Steve Patten, who is an associate professor in political science and also the associate dean of research in the Faculty of Arts right now. And then last but never least, Donia, Mounsef, associate professor in the Department of Drama, but also is at Campus Saint-Jean. Welcome, everybody. All right. So our first question that we're going to ask our panelists to address as they see fit is, how has digital media challenged or unsettled our notion of truth? And we are going to start with Carrie, but anybody who feels they need to, just come into the conversation.
Thank you, Julie. I will be speaking about digital feminism in this context of truth and post-truth throughout our conversation today. And just briefly, I would say from the perspective of digital feminism, which I see here in our conversation synonymous with digitally driven feminist activism, though in other areas I define it differently, digital media, and specifically social network sites and hashtags, challenge our notions of truth that are established through patriarchal structures of violence. And they, of course, provide a voice for those who otherwise feel that they do not have a community. So I think if we begin by this notion of truth, unsettling ostensible truths is a powerful tool for feminist media, and in the case of digital feminism, for transcultural, intersectional, and transnational community building, because truth, of course, can be another word for normative discourse. It can also, of course, be another word for speaking up and speaking out, so it goes in both directions, questioning the validity of truths. So I guess the question from the perspective of digital feminism that I'm asking, in addition to this question, is the act of questioning then also a post-truth, questioning truth and post-truth coming together?
All right, thank you very much. We do have next on the list William Anselmi, if you want to weigh in.
Thank you, Judy. Yeah. Sure. I'm interested in what Carrie has brought about. I mean, this questioning, right? And in terms of questioning, I thought I could play with a paradox. In terms of, we're talking about the post-truth, I would like to play with the idea of post-belief. In other words, to be a truth, there has to be a belief or a believing mechanism involved. And I wonder, really, given the conditions here we're living in after the recent U.S. elections, but more than that, because I think if I can go off into a tangent, the American post-elections have been, in a way, the production of Donald Trump has been already in setting by certain other political figures or post-political figures like Silvio Berlusconi. So with this type of representations, let's call them representations for a moment, they do involve a certain participation from the public, which we call populism, which we call a sort of believing rather than analysis, factual analysis, etc., etc. But at the same time, since we're talking about the post-truth, then we should really be talking also about post-belief. In other words, that we pick and choose whatever we want out of the market, not of ideas, but in a market of information and communication that surrounds us the moment that we step into the world, because I think we're becoming more and more digitalized. So that would be, for me, a starting point to question, really, at one point, how far can we intersect with a kind of a recuperated sacredness, because I don't think the part of the sacred and the religious has really ever disappeared from the public sphere, and how this attaches itself into new forms, and therefore we can talk about, once again, the post-belief or belief, right? That would be my little starting point. Thank you.
Well, so far we have managed to have a small discussion about feminism. We have now touched on the idea of belief and religious practice. What else could there be? Sourayan.
Thank you, Julie. Well, I come at these questions from the perspective of decolonization and cultural studies, as well as the critical social sciences. And I guess, I mean, the first point that I would make is that this question about us being in a post-truth era is a very big question. It's a very big, amorphous kind of idea in that respect. And just as much as it is complete, I think that it's very, very important for us to think in these historical terms, in terms of this kind of periodization that's proposed in the idea of a post-truth era. I would want to begin by questioning to what extent we were ever in a truth era, especially if we're talking about the American media system or North American media ecology and so on. So that would be where I would begin.
We never move beyond the beginning, as good scholars should not. Okay, please go ahead, Steve.
Well, how does digital media unsettle our notions of truth? I think it does it in a couple of very different ways. First, I'd like to say the truth should always be unsettled. It should always be challenged, and that's important. There is no truth, but there should be a communicative space where we discuss and have debates about truth. And one of the really positive things about digital media is it makes access to information more democratic. It allows more people to engage in this debate about truth, and that's where the digital feminism comes in. But at the same time, another thing that's happening is that it allows for the creation of these closed communicative networks within social media where people get to retreat into what you referred to as their world of believing. Rather than being out there in the public in a communicative space, battling about the truth and discovering the truth and unsettling the truth, they retreat into their own space and they attach themselves to a particular truth or a particular belief would be a more accurate way of saying it.
Okay, so I see Steve really picking up some threads about what truth means in terms of belief system or a belief space from which it comes. Do you have some thoughts about all of this?
Sure.
Okay, Donia.
Thank you. I would like to problematize the notion of post, following with what Sourayan. Have we ever been in a truth paradigm? I don't think we have. But I'm coming at it from notions of immediacy rather than hypermediacy, coming at it from the performative, from embodiment. What happens to the body in post-truth? Are those bodies that are being presented and represented there? Are they really there? This is a question we need to ask. I think it's really important to bring back that recuperated sacredness. In theater, we debate the recuperated sacredness, but not from the perspective of is it true, but from the perspective of the value of its truthiness, vraisemblance. In theater, we make a difference between truth and credibility. I think bringing the notion of the credible and what is there. Is there a presence, and how do we reconstruct co-presence in a post-truth environment?
All of you have a lot to say here, but all of you are challenging every piece of these terms. So just to think about this for a second and then see if together you wish to be in a scrum about that. Some of you want to work against the idea of post, the idea that we are even historicizing this or saying that this is an era. Some of you are saying, listen, truth, we're talking about belief systems, we're not talking about off-on switches, we're talking about something very different discursively. Some of you are just challenging gender anyway, like in a post-truth era. What does that mean for feminist interactions around digital media? Some of you are claiming that the idea of digital media absolutely unsettles truth, even ipso facto, even in its existence. So you've got a lot of things going on here. Now that you've challenged every piece of these terms, what do you think about post-truth era when you hear that phrase? And when you're thinking about how we're teaching our students and how we're thinking about these things now, is there a shift that has been precipitated, or is it just another one of the situations where the United States claims to have been part of a paradigm shift and it's already been going on? Out of your own scholarly locations, can you respond to that? Anybody go?
Can we call the era rather than the post-truth the Pinocchio era? Because
Love it.
because
Pinocchio
this way we
era,
can.
you have heard it here first.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Because I think we can sort of, in speaking in the idea of an historical perspective and looking at the various periods, one thing that concerns me, I mean, before the post-truth, is what postmodernism has given light to or life to in terms of this continuous questioning of everything. And also, as I'm doing this, I'm questioning myself so that I can co-participate in the discussion, is the fact that at one point, by relativizing everything and therefore following a sort of a Nietzschean dictum, to unsettled every type of discursive practice, we end up really with this kind of walking in the void. It's almost like a cartoon type of situation. You're still walking, but you're not falling, but you're going to fall eventually. And the fall, I think, and it's not a religious term in this context, the fall is really given by the fact that we cannot grasp anything. And I wonder then, and I want to question, what is the relationship between truth and fact? Because in Europe at one point, a couple of years ago, about 3-4 years ago, there's been talk about this new realism. Mainly it was Germany and Italy in the in the discipline of philosophy, trying to bring back and to undo the damage that some of postmodernism has given us, which is not being able to point to anything, and it's always being self-reflexive on discourses. So I would like to question, what is the relationship then between facts and truth? Can a fact be a truth, or is it simply an interpretation still?
Okay.
I think specifically around this, I mean, I am a bit nervous around conversations around truth and fact and questioning digital media as being a space of always also never the truth, right, or creating truths. Talking about digital feminism specifically, I think around the way in which activism and hashtags around truth and uncovering facts has been used in terms of uncovering rape culture specifically, right? So it does become very, very complicated and beyond sort of the postmodern, I think, when we're talking about very specific acts of conversations, questioning truths and uncovering truths.
Yeah. Having just picking up on that thread, I'm just thinking, Donia, your early comment about bodies and what do bodies mean in post-truth era? Do you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, and Roland Barthes talking about photography and evidentiary photography, he says that the power of authentication supersedes or exceeds the power of representation in evidentiary photography. But I think in the post-truth era, the power of representation exceeds the power of authentication. So right now we look at pictures, for example, the inauguration pictures, right, which caused a Twitter storm, right? We're looking at these two pictures, and the one from the inauguration of Trump and the inauguration of Obama, one does not make the other one authentic. I started questioning, was that really the Obama picture? In my mind, right? It didn't make me, I know that was the Trump's picture, but it also made me question the other one. The question of authentication becomes really important. How do we authenticate? We're no longer focused on what is truth. We're focused now how. We need to be focused on how truth is constructed. And who gets to say, yeah, that's an actual picture of beheading. For example, the pictures of beheading that came out from the ISIS terror. But we are in a space where we need to question how it's constructed, more so than what is.
So moving from the what to the how is what you're saying here. Does anybody want to think about that a little more here?
Sure, I'll jump in. I mean, I think that both Carrie and Donia raise very important issues here. And in terms of historicizing and thinking historically, but at the same time questioning this idea that we're now in a post-truth era where we used to be in a truth era and so on, I wouldn't want to suggest that, or this doesn't necessarily mean a kind of situation where you're relativizing, all claims to truth and so on and so forth, right? If we think about some of these things, and in fact in critical media studies, the point had long been made that even if it's the case that with the standards and procedures and methodologies of investigative journalism, for example, that journalists can get specific facts completely right. You can make claims that are true and other claims that are patently false and so on and so forth. That's at the level of specific, let's say, news claims, right? But if you think about media as an ecology overall, it's the total system that is false in the sense that there's all kinds of economic interests, political interests, the question of editorial biases and so on, that leads to what was classically described as systematically distorted communication. Mm-hmm. That is the kind of media system that has developed over the 19th century and lived throughout the 20th century. Are we going through some kind of changes now? Perhaps. But anyway, I'll stop here and let other people speak.
Maybe one way to do this is to connect a little bit to what Steve was saying about the question of access, when the media systems we have today were developing in the 19th century, they were connected to several things. One of them was insurance interests, but another obviously was celebrity discourse, which required that structure, and the structure required celebrity, right? And that was a question of access. Different bunches of people were getting access to a new set of print media, for example. So I'm wondering what you would want to think about this because of your claims about democratization and access.
Yeah, I was also thinking just about this periodization and whether there ever was an era of truth, and why we're calling this moment the post-truth era. There never was an era of truth, but there was an era where people believed we were in an era of truth. And in that era, it was a truth that was exclusionary. It had its biases. It was connected with power structures, but it wasn't actively challenged. And the challenges that have really destabilized that kind of truth began in an era of mass communication. And they were in many ways democratizing because they were often coming from progressive forces that were saying, my situated knowledge is important and I have the right to challenge what is accepted as truth. And in that way, they were questioning truth, but we didn't call it the post-truth era. We sometimes talked about postmodernism, post-structuralism, the situated knowledge, the contribution of feminists, and all of those sorts of things. But we didn't call it post-truth. The interesting thing about the present moment is sort of the right libertarian populists who aren't trying to go out into the public sphere and challenge. They're willing to build their own communities where they just say, we know the truth in here and we believe it, and where we have the right to judge the facts. We have the right to judge facts, and that's the way in which it's very libertarian. It's saying, of all my human rights, one of the strongest is that I can say what is true. And that's when we're starting to talk about post-truth. So it's not about the challenges of digital feminists. It's about the challenge of these exclusionary, sort of disconnected right libertarian populists.
I think this is a good time to move to our second question, which is, what is fake news? How do we pin down a term that it says here has been co-opted by multiple interest groups and or sides in the political arena, but I would say certainly has been the home of the kind of right-wing populism that you're describing, Steve. So what is fake news? Should we even be using a term like that, given where it has come from? Please explore. Go ahead.
I think it's important to use the term, even though it's corrosive and it's toxic media. We had that debate in another incarnation. Fake news is not that the people can't differentiate between fiction and fact. It's that they trust the sources that they have, regardless of what the sources are telling them. It's almost messianic. It's this notion of faith, this notion of belief. Whatever is presented to them, they will accept it. It's not. Then I don't think they're debating truth or lies anymore. And that's where totalitarianism and the risks that Hannah Arendt identified is what we can't differentiate anymore between truth and lies. And that's where say, the Nazi regime infiltrates itself into the public discourse, and we're seeing it in elections in France and so on.
So you're really making a case around what is propaganda in that way.
But isn't there also an aspect that we should consider, which is when we're talking about this, that there are actually two languages involved that we should explore. One is the language of words, and one is the language of images. So that I'm sure Carrie would want to respond to this in terms of the fact that let me think about the movie that comes out in 1978, which was Capricorn 1, if the date is precise, which is the questioning, first of all, of the moon landing, and at the same time, the fabrication of the moon landing through this popular film. What we're questioning first and foremost is the images that we receive, right? And then you can tie that film to something like Videodrome and start questioning really. So this world that we live in, which can be seen to possess at least two languages, one which is the written, so that when we look at the word I can question it, whereas when I'm looking at an image, I can even question myself, am I really there? Because I'm here, but I'm there too. So, right? I mean, it becomes a self-dialectical moment, very, very self-reflexive. But should we not really question then the languages at use in our communicative systems, environment of communication, and at the same time perhaps see that there are different grammars at work, or is there a kind of a meta grammar that encompasses both, right? Because for some we're still living in the era of the image. We haven't gone post-image yet. I guess that would be when we become really all virtual and
Or all sound.
virtuous. I don't know,
Yes.
virtual or virtuous, I'm not sure.
Oh, and with that, we need to see fake news. What do you have to say?
Yeah, I can jump off sort of this and also returning to the question of populism. I mean, I think that that's a really interesting question, the difference, of course, in fake news between images and words. And, when I'm thinking about populism and the question of the post, and I think, of course, of post-feminism, right, as a sort of popular form of white feminism, really, ultimately. Image comes to mind, of course, as you were speaking, William. A recent image that was going around the German news cycle and hit Twitter was, of course, the video of a panel discussion with Angela Merkel, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and Ivanka Trump, among others. And the question was asked, who's a feminist? Angela Merkel did not raise her hand, but Ivanka Trump did. And so there's this image, of course, of her saying, I'm a feminist. But what kind of, we're talking about sort of populism, we're talking about a different kind of feminism, of course. And that is the image that then sticks. And so what becomes co-opted is, of course, the way in which, Trump says she's a feminist, but the German chancellor does not. And the words, of course, are much more subtle than that, but the fake news is then the reproduction of the image.
Okay, and so here we're on to the question of reproduction. You want to have a thought about that, Steve?
Well, that's not the thought I had in my mind.
Oh, well, you can have the thoughts you wish to think.
When you first asked the question about fake news, you asked about using the term.
Yes.
It's a very useful term within communities where you're sharing an understanding of it. The problem is, politically to use it, is it has so many different meanings. I mean, it first came to our attention through blatantly fake news that was trying to trick people, and trying to get clicks on websites. And then it was used in a variety of other ways. It was used as a slur to discredit things that weren't fake news by that first definition. And then it's been used in more nuanced ways to get at the ways in which propaganda and certain spins on understandings of things are used to shape our understandings of the truth. So fake news is used in different ways, and politically it can be dangerous because you can talk about fake news in relation to propaganda, and people say, no, this isn't like that fake news that's blatantly just trying to get clicks on a website, and then your message doesn't fly politically.
Okay, that's a really interesting thought about a set of genealogies for the term, actually, which I think is helpful. Any other thoughts about fake news?
Well, I guess I can pick up on a couple of things that people have raised and maybe come at it in a slightly different kind of way. I mean, one of the aspects of the question of the fabulous and the fake and so on is that it's long been part of a media ecology, right? And I remember one of my favorite media things is this tabloid called The Weekly World News, where presidents and other people would regularly be kidnapped by aliens and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
Media studies scholars have pointed out how sort of the Gutenberg Enlightenment news media, the quality papers, well, actually quality TV, if you think about the U.S. public television and so on, that all of these, and corporate news especially, that they have used, and there's been a bleeding of the boundaries between the theatrical and a kind of Enlightenment epistemology that is supposed to underpin our descriptions of what's going on in the news and so on, right? And in terms of that, I think that the way, from the research perspectives that I work in, the way that I would think about this is that the arrival of the culture of the Enlightenment in North America needs to be thought about in terms of the way in which, for example, Las Vegas hotels create these replicas of the Egyptian pyramids, or that Enlightenment culture is basically a Disneyland ride.
I have often thought that Las Vegas is the world's most truthful city. It admits that it fabricates, and that would sound a little bit like what you were saying about how some of those things operate.
Can I just jump in? I mean, just to follow, because I think you raise a very interesting point insofar as we're talking about the spectacle, and the spectacle supersedes everything else. So that we are ready, what we are talking about is already contained within the spectacle. And so one should really give credit to Guy Debord for having already brought us an interesting apparatus by which we can decode the moment that we're living in. And I would like to add to this, because it's obviously always part of the news, the idea of terrorism, right? It is one of the most visible and entertaining aspect of the news. And before it's saying, well, what creates it? How do we know if it's true or not? Has it really happened? The beheading, what have you, right? And who has instructed these people to make such interesting, horrific movies that at one point really resonate with us because it's part of our culture. But I think if we lose contact with the spectacle and what Guy Debord brought about, I think we're losing an important aspect in our analysis. So thank you for bringing back up the idea of the spectacular.
The return of Guy Debord and
Yes.
Las Vegas. All right, well, they never left. All right, when we start to think about this question here that I have before us, maybe this is a good place to transition to this. How do different places in the world, so not just the United States, but other places, think through or navigate what is becoming a post-truth landscape? Perhaps a parafactual landscape would be more interesting for you to think about, or a propagandistic landscape. And here I'm thinking not only about the necessity of being able to decode and recode the spectacle and understand our position, but to see how are people navigating, how do they, is there an increase, for example, in questioning what you're seeing now that some of the aspects of news filtering through social media have destabilized some of those things. And have you seen any evidence of that? How are people worldwide in terms of your own research? What do you know about that? How are people working inside of this landscape?
I can contribute something to this conversation in the notion that when we're debating truth, we're opposing it to that which is not true.
Yes.
So in theatrical term, it's what's on stage and what's off stage. The off stage is
Very
the
good.
obscene, obscene, right? So the what is off stage is going to remain the opposite. So right now, when now we're not working with that opposition anymore. Now that indexical bond with the real is being questioned. So it's being refuted even. There's no especially to go back to the question of fake news. When we put fake next to news, we're saying that what is the indexical bond with the real, what that the news is supposed to deliver,
Well,
is no
yes.
longer.
We're assuming that
bond-
news is real when we do that,
when
absolutely.
we do that, right? So that which is hidden is now obscene in a way. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
So there is no offstage,
There's
is
no more
what you're
offstage.
actually saying, which is a very interesting way to reconceptualize this. Any other thoughts here?
Well, I'll jump in by actually going back to, I think Steve made a couple of very important points that I want to kind of elaborate on a little bit more. And in terms of this question, I mean, part of it is also whether we're speaking specifically about a media system, or the media system in general terms, or about culture in general in terms of the question of post-truth and so on, especially in other parts of the world, because rapidly the question could sort of degenerate into some, vague set of thoughts about what's happening to the Enlightenment and should it go to other parts of the world and so on. And I think it's quite important to...
And how's it worked out when it went there? How's that going?
Exactly. So I think that the one of the important points that Steve made is that this Enlightenment media system was never meant for everybody. It's excluded all kinds of people throughout of its history. I mean, the corporate media system, even though African Americans are everywhere in it, it's hard to say that their voices and their historical experiences are the truth of that is spoken in any kind of way through this media system. The same would go for Indigenous people, the same would go for precarious workers, the same would go for most women, the same would go for all kinds of people that are not inside the lifeboat of the corporate world in that respect. And I think that the question of what's happening around the world has to be put in those terms. And what really is going on is a kind of crisis of expertise, I would say, insofar as claims to truth are now basically for sale, and it's money that runs everything, not any kind of Enlightenment epistemology in that regard. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, the thought I had when you asked the question about how the truth is being navigated in different spaces and places and thinking about around the world is, well, the first thought was, I don't know the world well enough. My second thought was, this isn't something that's just defined by space and place. It's also defined by generations, classes, different communities within the same space. And I think the place of spectacle, the access to media systems, and putting it in plural, are very different for people who are located differently within our political economy. It's hard to talk about how people navigate this in any kind of general sort of way, because it really is differentiated by generation, class, and so on.
And yet there seems to be lowest common denominators that bound everything together. As we talk about Donald Trump, obviously being a back of our heads, I mean, if we could also talk about how has Berlusconi worked as a primary model to instruct others in certain representations. I mean, with Berlusconi, we woke up in the morning having the world one view, having one worldview, and by night it was already changed, etc., etc. And there was an element of entertainment that I think we are missing out on in the Donald Trump era, which is, for example, I know it's kind of a cynical entertainment, but it's still entertainment we've bought into, which is the fact that he would actually practice jokes in the morning in front of the mirror, so that the first thing that he would do as a politician was to entertain whomever publics he would be addressing. And in a way, Trump is also doing that as well, his emissaries are doing that for us.
I was thinking maybe his emissaries, but do you think he even practices?
Oh, no.
To my mind,
No, he's a natural.
That's probably
He's a
how
natural.
it is that he's president, is that he appears to be a natural.
Yeah.
In the fullest sense of what that term means. And of course, that is the most mediated thing you can be. And so I was wondering if he was the anti-Berlusconi.
No, I see it as a follow-up to Berlusconi. I mean, within the pattern Berlusconi has established, which I would like to bring back to the idea of Pinocchio. I mean, you can lie and get away with it and have fun at the same time. But at the same time, we forget, but who's maneuvering Pinocchio? Who's behind the threads? Because then really we have to talk about the corporate world and how certain things are moved and created and lived for us, or how we're instructed to live in this type of world or worlds, right?
Okay. Any other thoughts before we move through this? I mean, this is a very complex question we're discussing.
Well, as genuine as Trump appears, and yet when requested to submit his taxes and refuse, he broke with a 40-year tradition of supposed transparency of the incoming president, right?
Yep.
So at the same time, there's the coexistence of the transparency or the lack of transparency and this appearance of genuineness. But I wanted to bring it back to the politics of location and the location of politics. We talked about the systems, but the question of where it's located and the locationality. Are these systems of post-truth kind of diffuse, and as was announced in postmodernism, post-structuralism, that these centers are going to be now decentered and diffuse, and we can't read. And is that the result of that? Is that the result of that problem with location and the location of politics, of post-truth?
I mean, I don't have an answer for that, but I agree. I mean, I think the issue around locationality is also really important, not only in terms of what is being disseminated and how these sort of media organs are being practiced and who gets to say what, but also how it's being received, right? So, I mean, the digital media scape is transnational. There is no locationality in some respects, but the consumer of that truth is very located, right? And I think that is the
pinpointed and surveilled.
And pinpointed and surveilled. And we also have to think, to add to this, not only locationality, but temporality, of course, right? So if we're thinking about the way in which facts are disseminated, but they also sometimes are hidden, or they reappear, or they pop up. Fake news might be 3 years old, but it's suddenly a new news item, or the timestamp.
Or people appear to die, and they did not die.
So, but I do think that these things come together, and I don't want to say somehow that the digital mediascape collapses temporality and spatiality. I don't think that happens actually, but I do think it makes it quite a bit more complicated in terms of the simultaneity of the various.
We're kind of in a euchronic time, as
Yes.
Somebody called it. I don't remember.
Given that, is there a possibility through digital media to speak truth to power, as there was during the print era? And there still would be. You could argue that socialism needed the newspaper as much as capitalism did. And and I've been thinking a lot about that myself because of being in various Twitter campaigns that were successful, but that were about people's bodies when their bodies were absent, and the problem of trolling. To me, these things are very fraught, and they're particularly fraught, I think, for people much younger than myself who are out there in that landscape. Is it possible to speak truth to power in a post-truth era?
That's a very important question, and I think it brings back what Shoshana Feldman said, talking about trauma theory, that there's a need for a witness when historical accuracy is in question. That's when we need the witness the most. And I think, do we have witnesses today? Where are the witnesses?
But how reliable
And
are the
how
witnesses?
reliable are they?
And who constructs the witness,
Exactly.
right? And what kind of credibility is behind? I mean, these are all things we lose in the digitization of what we've been talking about in terms of the communicative devices. Where is the expertise? How do we question with an internet if this is true or false, if not thanks to certain filters that not everybody possesses?
But some of the,
in
go
terms
ahead, Steve.
of political power, digital media provides an opportunity to speak truths of power, to organize campaigns, to try to really make a difference. But it also creates an opportunity for power to ignore, because what it does politically is it allows you to isolate your base by having a base that's in a different communicative world that you can rely on to support you. And in most of our electoral systems, you don't need the majority. You just need your base. And so there's new opportunities to speak truth to power, but there's also new opportunities for power to ignore.
Having said this, we know that in Russia, for example, a place where media is not allowed to circulate freely, a group like Pussy Riot did attempt to do that, was jailed for it. There's a worldwide fallout around that. Do we discount those kinds of movements in our present time, or do we say that they get a valence through this medium that they would not have had otherwise? Is there a possibility of that?
Yeah, surveillance. I think that's important to surveil from
Surveillance
below,
instead of
right?
surveillance.
Surveillance. Steve Mann coined the term.
Yes.
But it's also necessary too to think how that double-edged sword works out. For example, the Occupy movement used social media to organize, but also the media giants, the telecommunication companies, communicated to the police the locations of the protesters and where they're gathering. So at the same time, right? I mean, I'm not saying anything new. People who've researched social media's impact in protest and social movement have talked about how it's also used against us in many ways.
At one point, all of this entertained by the flash mob. I mean, the flash mob is a moment of collectivity which is brought together certainly for a certain short period and then dissolved. And to me, that is in the essence of how the world we're living in utilizes political activity. They cannot go further than this kind of, I know I'm going against the current, but it cannot go beyond that, precisely because it becomes itself part of the spectacle, and it gives itself the chance to be integrated and surveilled, right? I mean, I know who they are. I mean, I'm already letting you know.
They know, from
We're
your
meeting
location right now, they're tracking you.
Oh, absolutely.
So I have an appointment.
I should hope so, actually. I want to be seen. All right, are there any other thoughts about this pretty fraught question about what the possibilities are for bodies inside of a post-truth era?
I do want to say one thing about this, and this is, I mean, you were asking about the question of is it possible to speak truth to power? The question of witnesses, are there witnesses, and so on. Like, regardless of everything that we've said and I've said about, whether or not we ever lived in a truth era and so on, it needs to be, I particularly want to really emphasize the importance of the often very heroic work that individual journalists and groups of journalists have done in the past and are doing now in terms of this question of witnessing and so on. And this is very, very important work, and I think that yes, it is possible, and of course it's very important in that regard. In terms of the question, some of the questions that William raised about, how this is also, what about the status of fabrication, reliability, what kind of effects this has, and so on. I think that the larger a problem that, let's say, a social justice politics kind of faces in terms of this question of witnessing, communicating, speaking the news, and so on and so forth, is the larger question of manipulation and instrumentalization. So is there a way for people to politically communicate with one another without that being just simply manipulation? In that regard. And I think that here, Harold Innis, Canadian...
We are back to the future.
Back to the future. Harold Innis had some very interesting thoughts about this. One of the things that the way he described the older kind of media system that we're still in, that maybe is changing and so on, he described it as industrialized communication based on the eye, and he described it as a system in which truth is reduced to information, and this is what gives this media system, it's what he described as a kind of space bias to
Yes.
it. Right? And I think that one of the things that he was pointing at in that analysis is the fact that in that respect, other forms, other media of communication that are more time biased or that are not information, where communication is not through information, but through poetry, through ritual, through oral traditions, and so on, that these would be ways in which one could still perhaps be able to develop ways of communicating that are not just simply instrumentalized in that regard.
We have certainly seen on this campus, but also across the country, that the work not only towards truth and reconciliation, but towards being responsible to the land we're on, would be an indicator of an alternate communication strategy that's proving effective. We have about 5 minutes left, and so I would like to go around and just ask if you have any last thoughts from our conversation about some of these questions, and I'm just going to revisit. How is digital media challenged or unsettled our notion of truth? What is fake news? How do different parts of the world navigate in a landscape like this? Is it possible to have a social justice movement in this kind of environment? Other questions included, what really is this power of surveillance and the spectacle in our current time, and how are we going to connect those things together? So I'll just go around to my left, actually. Why not? We're on the left at the moment, and ask what your thoughts are.
The only thing that I can give is the idea that we should really cultivate those instruments, those filters that would allow as many people as possible to be able to decode whatever message is coming, so that not simply to fall into this faithfulness approach, but rather a kind of a critical approach. Still, however limited, I still value the idea of a critical reading of reality, and to make those tools available to others.
Yeah, the space of reflexivity, Nietzschean space. Okay, please go
Yeah,
ahead.
I think it's important also to think about post-truth as posthumous truth, and and then we're just dancing on the body right now, on the grave, right, of this dead truth. But also, how do we accept or reconcile multiple renditions of what people believe to be their truth, right? In a world of highly individualized, what you just said, everybody thinks that it's their own, their truth is as valid and credible as everybody else's. That's a problem in itself.
Yep.
But we are in that contingent reality, and we have to be able to not reconcile, but try to find a way that these multiple renditions can actually find space and not feel marginalized.
Right. Okay, so we're working back towards understanding what those spaces actually mean. Can we evaluate or weigh them? All of these important questions. Go ahead, Sourayan.
All right. As a last thought, I'll say one provocative thing and one other relevant thing, I guess.
You have less than a minute, so do
All
it
right.
quick.
Well, I think that the whole question of post-truth is really a kind of moral panic that comes out of the collapse of the Democratic Party, and the fact that it undermined the only authentic political possibility that came out of the U.S. Constitution in this particular context, which was the Sanders movement kind of thing. The other point that I'd make is that where that leaves us is a project of trying to develop systems of communication that might be based on what the philosopher Jacques Rancière describes as the equality of intelligences.
Thank you. That's very provocative. Please go ahead, Carrie.
Yeah, just coming off of that, this idea of moral panic. I mean, of course, in some respects, certain groups have always lived under moral panic, and the fact that, I mean, if we think of, feminists and women of color have always lived under post-truth eras, really.
Exactly.
So we're speaking of a specific type of era, really. And I think the other thing I would sort of think about is I felt this conversation tipping towards, we will never have the possibility to speak against the power. I do think that there's a tension that happens here right now in our conversation that is really important. That tension that is produced by thinking about post-truth in the way that we are. So I do, even if that becomes co-opted and there's a circular nature to this conversation, not our conversation, but the conversation that's happening out there, I think even in that circularity, that tension is really important.
Thank you for highlighting that tension. Steve, last word.
Last thing I'd say might be the same as the first thing I said. We never were in a truth era. And what's really important is having that shared space in which we do our battles about the truth. And what concerns me now is people leaving that space into their own little spaces where belief is more important than truth.
I particularly want to thank our panelists for not only affirming that shared space is important to debate these questions, but for caring about what this means to us as we're sitting in an era that's changing, but digital media is central to it. And I want to thank all of you for participating in this conversation and in the great out there. We look forward to your comments and thoughts on this topic and others today in Around the World. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.